Medieval fantasy did not remain trapped in ancient storytelling traditions alone. Instead, it evolved continuously as new generations reinterpreted old myths creatively. Modern literature expanded medieval fantasy beyond its original European cultural boundaries. Authors began blending global mythologies with traditional knight and castle frameworks. This fusion created richer and more diverse fantasy worlds for readers. The influence of medieval fantasy can be seen in nearly every epic story. Even science fiction sometimes borrows medieval structures for political and social systems. This shows how deeply medieval fantasy shapes modern narrative thinking overall. The idea of kingdom still dominates fantasy world building in literature today. Hierarchies, monarchies, and feudal systems remain common storytelling frameworks globally. These systems help writers create structured societies within fictional universes. Readers easily understand conflict when framed within medieval-inspired power structures. This clarity is one reason the genre remains so popular worldwide. Medieval fantasy also influenced character archetypes used in modern storytelling. The noble knight evolved into the modern heroic protagonist archetype. The wise wizard became a symbol of hidden knowledge and guidance. The Dark Lord represents ultimate evil and moral opposition in stories. These archetypes simplify storytelling while maintaining emotional depth and meaning. Many modern novels still rely on these foundational character structures. Even when settings change, the medieval influence remains clearly visible. Fantasy literature uses medieval imagery to create instant familiarity for readers. Castles immediately signal adventure, conflict, and historical imagination to audiences. Swords represent personal combat and honor-based storytelling traditions in fiction. Armor symbolizes protection, duty, and sacrifice within heroic narratives. These symbols are deeply rooted in medieval historical imagination. Writers often exaggerate medieval elements to enhance dramatic storytelling impact. This exaggeration makes fantasy worlds feel larger than historical reality. Medieval fantasy also shaped how magic systems are structured in stories. Magic often feels like a hidden force within a rigid society. This contrast between order and chaos defines many fantasy narratives. Religious influence in medieval fantasy adds depth and moral complexity. Prophecies often guide heroes toward destiny-driven storylines and events. This concept comes directly from medieval belief systems and folklore traditions. Modern literature reinterprets these ideas in more flexible and creative ways. Political intrigue in fantasy mirrors real medieval court conflicts historically. Betrayals and alliances create tension within royal kingdoms and dynasties. These elements make fantasy stories feel emotionally grounded and realistic. Medieval fantasy also shaped the pacing of modern epic storytelling structures. Long journeys across kingdoms build emotional development for characters over time. Side quests and trials reflect medieval heroic quest traditions in literature. These structures allow gradual world building and character evolution throughout narratives. Modern authors often expand these journeys into multi-book fantasy series. This long-form storytelling style originates from medieval epic traditions. Even modern films adopt medieval fantasy pacing and structure techniques. The influence extends beyond books into television and gaming industries. Video games especially rely on medieval fantasy for immersive world design. Players explore kingdoms, castles, and magical lands inspired by medieval lore. This interactive storytelling deepens engagement with fantasy worlds significantly today. Medieval fantasy also influences art and visual storytelling across media. Illustrations often depict armor, dragons, and castles in dramatic forms. These visuals reinforce the emotional tone of fantasy narratives effectively. Fashion and design sometimes borrow medieval fantasy aesthetics creatively as well. The genre even influences modern architecture in themed environments globally. Medieval fantasy has become a cultural language of imagination and storytelling. It connects modern audiences with ancient mythological storytelling traditions. This connection creates a sense of timelessness within fantasy literature. Readers feel both historical grounding and imaginative freedom simultaneously. That balance is what makes medieval fantasy so enduring today. Its influence continues expanding across new creative mediums and formats, and its legacy still shapes how we imagine fictional worlds today. The legacy of medieval fantasy continues to evolve in modern literature today. It no longer exists only as imitation of historical European imagination alone. Instead, it has become a flexible framework for global storytelling creativity. Writers now reinterpret medieval elements through diverse cultural perspectives and experiences. This expansion has made the genre more inclusive and internationally influential. Modern fantasy often blends medieval settings with futuristic or alternative themes. This hybrid style keeps storytelling fresh while honoring traditional foundations. Even dystopian worlds sometimes borrow medieval power structures and hierarchies. This shows how adaptable medieval fantasy has become in literature. The emotional appeal of knights and kingdoms remains strong across audiences. Readers still connect deeply with themes of honor, sacrifice, and destiny. These timeless values keep medieval fantasy relevant in modern storytelling eras. Many best-selling novels still rely on medieval-inspired world-building techniques today. Authors use familiar medieval tropes to quickly establish immersive fictional worlds. This helps readers enter complex stories without confusion or disorientation. Medieval fantasy also influences character development in modern literary fiction. Heroes often begin as ordinary individuals before rising into legendary figures. This transformation reflects medieval heroic myths and storytelling traditions clearly. Villains are often portrayed as corrupted rulers or fallen noble figures. This adds emotional depth to conflicts within fantasy narratives today. Modern literature also explores darker and more realistic medieval interpretations. These stories highlight brutality, politics, and survival within harsh societies. This shift adds realism to what was once purely romanticized history. Medieval fantasy is no longer limited to idealized knights and kingdoms. It now includes complex moral ambiguity and flawed heroic characters. This evolution reflects changing reader expectations and literary sophistication over time. Fantasy worlds today often question traditional medieval power structures critically. This creates more layered storytelling with ethical and philosophical depth. Medieval fantasy also inspires world building in science fiction universes. Galactic empires often mirror medieval kingdoms in structure and hierarchy. This demonstrates how deeply medieval storytelling logic influences modern genres. Even futuristic narratives cannot escape medieval narrative foundations completely. The genre also thrives in digital storytelling platforms and online fiction. Writers collaborate globally to expand medieval-inspired universes creatively together. This collective creativity strengthens the genre's cultural relevance worldwide today. Film and television continue adapting medieval fantasy literature into visual epics. These adaptations bring ancient-inspired worlds to global mainstream audiences. They also reinforce iconic imagery like castles, swords, and dragons. Gaming industries further expand medieval fantasy through interactive experiences and narratives. Players actively participate in shaping medieval-inspired fictional worlds themselves. This interactivity deepens emotional connection to fantasy storytelling experiences overall. Medieval fantasy also influences music, art, and cultural design aesthetics. Its themes appear in symphonies, paintings, and modern visual art styles. This widespread influence proves its enduring cultural and artistic significance. Educational studies often analyze medieval fantasy for historical and literary insights. It helps scholars understand how history transforms into imaginative storytelling. The genre acts as a bridge between fact and creative fiction. Readers learn history indirectly through its fantasy reinterpretations and symbolism. This educational value adds another layer to its cultural importance. Medieval fantasy continues shaping how humans imagine heroism and conflict. It reflects humanity's ongoing fascination with power, destiny, and identity. New generations reinterpret medieval fantasy in increasingly innovative ways today. Each reinterpretation adds new meaning to ancient storytelling traditions. This constant evolution keeps the genre alive and relevant globally. Medieval fantasy is not a static genre, but a living narrative system. It grows with each author, reader, and cultural interpretation added. Its influence stretches across centuries of storytelling, development, and change. Modern literature owes much of its fantasy structure to medieval inspiration, and that influence continues shaping future stories yet to be written. Ultimately, medieval fantasy remains the timeless heart